Well now, would you look at that video title? To the surprise of nobody, I'm back on my 16-bit bullshit. Jokes aside, I had a lot of fun making my first list of great soundtracks on the Sega Genesis, despite the fact that I got sick multiple times while making it, and even had my old Model 2 Genesis kick the bucket after several years of on and off play. And although there was an almost 6-year gap between that first list and my last countdown type video, reception was overwhelmingly positive. Truth be told, I can't tell which was the stronger motivator for making a sequel. The people asking to see another list and suggesting games, or that I already had more than a few favorite soundtracks I had to cut from the original list. Either way, there's plenty more material to work with here, and even though I don't think it's entirely necessary to watch the original list to enjoy this one, I will include a link to the first video both on screen and in the description. As good as that initial batch of games was, I was just getting started when it came to showing how powerful and versatile the twin sound chips of the Sega Genesis were, and there were even some aspects of the console and its history that I didn't get to mention, aspects which I made sure I'd get to tackle this time around. If I'm gonna earn myself a Cyber Razor cut like a proper Sega nut, I gotta do it the right way, you get what I'm saying? After reviewing the comments on the first video, as well as the leftovers of my larger list, I've put together another batch of 10 Sega Genesis games with standout soundtracks, 8 of which involve bringing up totally new composers with styles distinct from the original group. Just as before, these are only titles from the base consoles library. I'm excluding games made for the Sega CD and the 32X for the sake of fairness, and not because I'm trying to build up suspense for an eventual hour-long discussion of the two soundtracks for Sonic CD. That's just crazy talk, and I don't know where you could possibly be getting that idea from. Anyways, we can't be spending too much time chatting idly when we've got a bunch of new soundtracks to enjoy, so let's get started, shall we? When it comes to starting a video like this, there are two main approaches you can take. You can ease into things gradually, or you can just kick the front door in. And guess who has a repair bill on their hands? That's right, John Morris and Eric Lecard. What? Do you think I'm some kind of raving lunatic promoting property damage? No. I'm here to tell you about the soundtrack for Castlevania Bloodlines. Although, now that you mention it, do human property laws apply to vampires? Castlevania Bloodlines, or Castlevania The New Generation if you're from Europe, holds an enduring reputation as one of the best games on the Sega Genesis, with some of the console's best music as well, and it was the very first that popped into my mind when I decided I wanted to do a video about great soundtracks on the Genesis. However, I chose not to include it in my original list so that I could highlight some lesser-known gems in its place. But now we're here with a fresh list, so I can gush about it as much as I like. Bloodlines marked the first time the series' music would be handled by Michiru Yamane, whose background with Baroque-era inventions, Romantic-era piano compositions, and modern genres like jazz and progressive rock made her style the perfect complement to Castlevania's gothic horror aesthetic. Although it's probably cliché to use it as the initial example, I have to start with the music for Stage 1, as well as the de facto main theme of Bloodlines, Reincarnated Soul. This piece offers one of the soundtrack's strongest showings of Michiru Yamane's musical style, especially her influence from Johann Sebastian Bach. Instances of Baroque-inspired ornamentation can be heard throughout the track, and the combined sound of its lead and bass channels reminds me of the distinct timbre of a harpsichord. But as far as personal favorites go, I actually prefer the music for the second stage. Titled The Sinking Old Sanctuary, it's a slower piece that accompanies the setting of an ancient Greek ruin cyclically falling into the sea and then rising back above it. It has a mystical quality to it, with its opening notes that remind me of Claude Debussy's The Sunken Cathedral, the ethereal synths humming in the background, and of course, the organ at the end of the loop. While I may have called Reincarnated Soul the de facto main theme of Castlevania Bloodlines, an equally strong argument could be made for the theme of Stage 4, Iron, Blue, and Tension, which has been officially remixed more than any other part of Bloodlines' soundtrack. And very understandably so, even if the stage where it plays is the rather modern setting of an Imperial German munitions factory. This track perfectly sets the tone with a powerful organ-driven introduction, before going into a combination of a snappy drum line, electric guitar, and brass synth that continue the dramatic tension. And the climax at the end of the loop is just incredible, bringing to mind several of Bach's pieces for organ. And unlike Toccata and Fugue in D minor, this one actually is about evil vampires. The theme for Stage 5, The Prayer of a Tragic Queen, goes for Baroque to match the setting of the Palace of Versailles, bringing back the harpsichord sound and making it stronger than ever, as well as adding new instruments, akin to a stringed instrument being played arco, a woodwind of some kind, and a harp. It's like a Baroque ensemble in 16-bit form. All the more incredible given Michiru Yamane made the soundtrack using only one sound chip. The end credits have yet another fantastic piece, but one that I don't see brought up as much as the others I've already mentioned. It's triumphant sounding to suit the end of the adventure, but also somewhat melancholy, since Dracula's resurrection has only been delayed as World War I continues to engulf Europe. Yeah, if you're not familiar with Bloodlines, World War I is part of the ritual to bring the old D-Man back. That might explain why the credits theme is called Requiem for the Nameless Victims, or maybe it's a developer in-joke. As one last thing to highlight, Bloodlines' soundtrack even has a selection of tunes from the classic Castlevania trilogy, adapted into Michiru Yamane's style. Most of these involve entering a code in the options menu, though there is an organ rendition of Simon Belmont's theme that plays before you face Dracula at the end of the game. As good as that is, I'd rather go with Michiru Yamane's take on Beginning from Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, just based on personal preference. The original Famicom piece was already incredible, but FM synth instruments and some of that Michiru Yamane magic makes it even better. When it comes to the classic Castlevania games, Bloodlines tends to be overshadowed by the original trilogy and Super Castlevania IV on Nintendo's hardware, but I'd argue it's just as capable and important to the franchise as the others. And especially when factoring the remixed classic tunes, Bloodlines feels like the perfect sweet spot between the sound of the original Castlevania games and what the franchise would become further down the line, with titles like Symphony of the Night, Curse of Darkness, and Portrait of Ruin further showing how well Michiru Yamane's musical style, whether solo or collaborative, fit like a glove. It may have been the only Castlevania title to be released on the Sega Genesis, but when it comes to music, it not only delivered a masterpiece for the console, but became an important influence on the Castlevania franchise at large. It feels so good to finally do this soundtrack justice. When it comes to notably prolific composers on the Sega Genesis, Matt Furness was a real champ at getting some impressive sounds out of the Maverick console, even though many of the games he worked on aren't exactly household names, or involved him adapting another musician's work for that game's Genesis port. But hey, shining a spotlight on lesser appreciated composers and the games they worked on is part of what I love about making these videos. And Matt Furness in particular has a diverse catalog of contributions to the Sega Genesis, from the many groovy jams of The Lost Vikings, to the dreamlike melodies of Pugsy, and the grungy synth rock of Wolfchild, but I decided to talk about what might be the quirkiest game he helped work on. Wiz and Liz, The Frantic Wabbit Wescue. Yes, that is the actual subtitle of the game. What a tonal 180 we just did from Castlevania Bloodlines. As a game, Wiz and Liz isn't exactly the most spectacular thing I've played on the Genesis. It's a very straightforward arcade-style platformer where your main enemy is the time limit, and it feels like it was meant to be enjoyed with a friend helping you out, rather than as a single-player experience. I don't mean all of this in a bad way either. It's a charming title from a small developer, and Matt Furness's work on the soundtrack is a big part of that. It's full of upbeat and catchy tunes that suit the fast-paced gameplay and sound fantastic on the Genesis's twin sound chips. I'm not even gonna lie, as soon as I heard the music on the title screen, I had the dumbest grin on my face, because I knew right then and there that I was going to love everything ahead. The gameplay hasn't even started yet, and Matt Furness is already flexing with a funky as hell bassline. It's like the Decapitac inventory screen all over again. Of the 8 levels that comprise Wiz and Liz, my favorite tracks would definitely be the ones that play for the Grassland, Snowland, and Temple Land stages. Grassland has a very disco-inspired bass line that takes prominence at the peak of the loop, Snowland's theme has a really cool synth solo that makes it stand out from the others, and Temple Land has that distinct style of Matt Furness's that I recognize from some of his other works on the console, namely the aforementioned port of The Lost Vikings. Bit of a shame that the game is so fast-paced, because I would stay in Temple Land just to listen to the music if I could. By the way, even though I said your main enemy in this game was the time limit, it also has boss battles for one reason or another. And while they're not all that complex or difficult, they're certainly freaky, given the lighthearted tone of everything else. Nothing like fighting a giant rattlesnake and shooting its eyes out. That surely won't terrify any young children. The music that plays for most of these bosses is just kind of there, in my opinion, but I do want to highlight the music for the creepy clock, because I love how it starts with ominous chimes as the boss descends into the battlefield. It gets brownie points for that. At the end of the day, Wiz and Liz is just fun. Simple, good fun that's bound to put a smile on your face, especially with its happy-go-lucky soundtrack that matches the fast-paced gameplay, even more so with a friend lending a hand. Could I have picked one of Matt Furness's more famous contributions to the Sega Genesis, like its versions of The Lion King or even Mortal Kombat? I absolutely could have. But where's the fun in that, compared to digging up a hidden gem like Wiz and Liz, and adding some magic to the mix? The world we live in is dictated by patterns. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Robots call me about my car's extended warranty. And food companies will license video games to try and encourage sales. From Domino's Yo Noid on the NES, to the cult classic Pepsi Man for the PlayStation 1, and even that recent KFC-themed dating sim that's on Steam, it's a trend nearly as old as video games themselves. And if this wasn't a bizarre enough premise with bizarre enough results, the Sega Genesis got a 2D platformer licensed by McDonald's and developed by Treasure, a company known for being, well, bizarre. It wasn't even the only McDonald's game on the Genesis, but much like the Sausage McMuffin with egg, it's the one I prefer, and the music is a major factor in that. The game, not what I order from the breakfast menu. Despite being an advertisement for the Golden Arches at its core, McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is actually a pretty decent 2D platformer in the Genesis library, and the soundtrack was handled by Katsuhiko Suzuki, marking not only his first job writing music for Treasure, but also the Sega Genesis in general. If Suzuki's name sounds a bit familiar, he was a mainstay of Treasure during both the Genesis and Saturn eras, and right after McDonald's Treasureland Adventure was released, he was working as the lead composer for Dynamite-Headdy. You don't even need to wait all that long to recognize his distinctive style of composition. The very first level of the game sounds like a blueprint for what Suzuki would fine-tune with Dynamite-Headdy. This game only has 4 stages, but they play out across multiple set pieces, with the first level ending inside a network of caverns. That might also be the digestive system of some unidentifiable giant creature, that also has sewers and pieces of machinery embedded in the walls. Yeah, this is a Treasure game, alright. The music that plays here reminds me a lot of Mystic Cave Zone from Sonic 2, with its walking bass line and tinge of menace, though to a comparatively lesser degree. But as good as Stage 1's tracks are, it's the second stage of the game where the best music is, if you ask me. The stage begins on a train zooming across the landscape, and I really can't get enough of the music that plays here. What mainly defines this track is the combination of a bouncing bass line and a steady drum beat, evocative of an old steam locomotive chugging along the track. But when it gets into the second half of the loop, there's a distinct harmonica-sounding instrument that joins in. And that right there is like honey to my ears, even if it only lasts for 8 seconds. Once you disembark and reach the town where the train was headed, the level enters its last phase, and you're greeted with another great example of Katsuhiko Suzuki's style. With its hip-hop inspired beat and squelchy lead synths, you could put it over gameplay footage of Dynamite-Headdy, and it would fit perfectly. As for the last two stages of the game, the main track that really stands out to me is the first half of Stage 4, as Ronald McDonald goes moonwalking. About halfway into the loop, the SN76489 PSG chip suddenly gets to be the star of the show for a few seconds, creating this really pretty sound that suits the extraterrestrial setting to a T. But before we move on to the next game, I have to mention the boss themes. Because yes, there are boss battles in a licensed McDonald's game, and unless you're familiar with Treasure's way of doing things, they do not sound like what you're expecting. Especially the music for the final boss. The music does not say Ronald McDonald is going to space. The music says Ronald McDonald is going to war. It can be easy to overlook McDonald's Treasureland Adventure as just another low-quality corporate license title in the Sega Genesis library, but if we casually forget how this game shows that Ronald McDonald is indeed capable of murder, we can see that Treasure knew how to use their magic to make it a good license title, especially with Katsuhiko Suzuki at the helm for the music. What else is there to say except, I'm loving it. Before we can get started on this next segment, I do need to warn you that there's a little bit of footage from one stage that takes place inside of a thundercloud that has some flashing effects that may be potentially dangerous to people with epilepsy or other such photosensitivity. There's a timestamp on screen in case you want to skip ahead and avoid the risk, or you can just switch to another tab so that you still get the audio but not the video. One of the things I love the most about the fourth generation of home consoles is how radically different each console sounded, offering different advantages and limitations for composers, as well as making each platform better suited to certain genres of music. In particular, I love me some good Genesis metal, since it was a genre that Sega's hardware could consistently handle better than its competition from Nintendo and NEC. And one of the essential titles when it comes to Genesis metal is M.U.S.H.A, also known as M.U.S.H.A Lest in Japan, since it was part of a larger series of shoot-'em-up games developed by Compile. While working on M.U.S.H.A, composer Toshiaki Sakura made it his mission to produce what he called the first ever heavy metal suite for a video game, citing Iron Maiden, Van Halen, Michael Schenker, and even Ludwig von Beethoven as his primary influences. And Sakura would go to great lengths to make sure that first impression was a resounding one, converting live instruments to digital notation across multiple computer models, making the most out of limited channels to prevent any sound effects from cutting into the music during gameplay, and even spending an entire month just tweaking the synth guitars to sound as close to realistic as possible. That's how dedicated Sakura was to his craft, and you can hear it clear as day. The first stage has good music, don't get me wrong, but it's the second stage where Sakura's genius starts to really shine. Befitting a track titled Galvanic Gear, it's a dramatic piece dominated by fast riffing as the guitars almost seem to be taking turns. It's Genesis metal in its purest form. How appropriate for a level set inside a moving battery. Normally, you'd expect the final stages of a shoot-'em-up to have the best parts of the soundtrack, but if you ask me, the peak of the M.U.S.H.A experience actually comes with the third stage of the game, as you fly through a fiery ravine, avoiding enemy projectiles and stage hazards alike, as well as seeing the enemies you shoot down fall into the abyss. The music that plays here is just as incredible and intense as the visuals, even if it won't win any awards with an awkward name like Armed Armor. What's important is how it sounds, and that's like a pair of dueling electric guitars that can roar like an animal. And although the apex of the game comes with the level before it, Stage 4 is another favorite of mine. Instead of being raw energy and danger from the get-go, there's some build-up to this one, as the stage leads upward into a thunderstorm, and the payoff at the end of the loop is nothing short of satisfying. Lest it be totally different, it's got the odd naming in common with Armed Armor, because I can't tell if this track has a typo or if it's supposed to be Divine Devise instead of Divine Device. At least that doesn't change how good the music itself is. While I'd say that the second half of the game doesn't quite match the crest of the third and fourth stages, I do think the music for the final stage is worth a highlight. As you run the gauntlet and fly straight into the enemy's main base, you get an adrenaline-pumping track that emphasizes the importance of your mission with the addition of a chime-like instrument from the YM2612 FM chip. You're too close to fail now. Fittingly, the last track I want to mention is the ending and credits theme, For the Love Of. With yet another awkward name, it's the send-off to Toshiaki Sakura's 16-bit heavy metal suite, and it definitely conveys a hard-fought victory. Accomplishment and satisfaction, but not without difficulties to be conquered. To close, let me offer you this bit of trivia. Near the end of production on M.U.S.H.A, Compile staff asked Toshiaki Sakura to redo the soundtrack, as there were concerns that it didn't match the game's aesthetic inspired by traditional Japanese motifs. Sakura responded by submitting new music made with intentionally terrible and weird-sounding synths mimicking Japanese instruments, which made Compile turn around and ask him to put the original music back in. Thank goodness there's at least one thing right about the timeline we live in. Before I can get to our next game from this batch, I need to explain a bit of technical information and console history here. In the first Genesis soundtracks video, I mentioned a handful of times that Sega's 16-bit black box was more difficult to write music for compared to its competition, but I never stated exactly why that was. Although the Mega Drive/Genesis was more successful in North America and Europe than it was in Japan, its dual sound chip setup tended to be a problem when non-Japanese composers had to write music for the system. This difficulty had to do with its primary chip, the Yamaha YM2612, which produced audio through a process called frequency modulation synthesis, or FM synth for short. During the 1980s and early 90s, sound chips utilizing FM synth were commonly used for arcade cabinets and home computers released in Japan, but elsewhere in the world, it was often very murky and confusing territory. This didn't exactly bode well for the console's international release, so SEGA of America commissioned California-based developer Recreational Brainware to create a tool that would simplify the process for musicians unfamiliar with FM synth. The Genesis Editor for Music and Sound Effects, or GEMS for short, because M.U.S.H.A just sounds weird. Over 200 Western-developed games on the Genesis had their soundtracks written using GEMS, comprising nearly a quarter of the console's entire official library, though it tends to be associated with a specific, unpleasant, and preset-reliant sound that's common to a large number of games. Chances are, if someone says they don't like the tinny sound of the Genesis, that's exactly what they're referring to. And yes, while it's difficult to fully separate GEMS from shovelware games, it was still a powerful tool in the right hands, having been used to produce the music for titles like Echo the Dolphin, Comic Zone, Toe Jam and Earl, and one game that proves GEMS' potential especially well, Vectorman. Yes indeed, you might be surprised to learn that composer John Holland used GEMS to write the soundtrack for both Vectorman and its sequel. But as the saying goes, it's not about the materials you have, it's how you use them. The developers at Blue Sky Software were captivated by John Holland's demos of electronic dance music, confident that his style would be an ideal fit for a cutting-edge platformer they were working on. Not only that, but John Holland was set on crafting something that would go against the established norms of music on the Sega Genesis. In his own words, techno-inspired syncopation is the core of Vectorman's soundtrack, turning the weakness of the console's limited sound channels into something deceptively more advanced. The track that I think best conveys this, and thus makes the best first impression for new listeners, is Metalhead, which plays for the game's second level. The fifth stage introduces a stellar theme, one that takes full advantage of the Sega Genesis' stereo audio with its panning beat that sounds best with headphones on. It does a great job matching the setting for both of the levels that it plays for, providing a mysterious yet foreboding sound for an Arctic cave system and an abandoned research facility. Another track I really enjoy is the theme for stages 7 and 14, which is on the more intense and dramatic side, almost as much as the music for the final level. Unlike the last highlight though, I feel like this one skews more heavily to the dark and dingy subterranean location of stage 14. Vectorman is, after all, set on a post-apocalyptic Earth. Even the options menu has great music. How often do you say that about a game, especially from this era of home consoles? This isn't me trying to set up a joke either. It really does sound like it could play for a late game level. Vectorman is not only another great example of the Sega Genesis's ability to emulate music that was popular during its lifespan, but it also shows how powerful the GEMS sound driver could be in the right hands. John Holland took the job wanting to create something that went against the expectations of how a Genesis game sounded, but he ended up creating a real double whammy in the process. The madman even did it twice, with a sequel released the very next year. But that's a story for another day. So here's another game that was on my original list of ideas, but didn't make the cut for the first video. Ranger X, a mech-themed run-and-gun game developed by GAO Entertainment, the same company that made Soleil, aka Crusader of Senti, one of my favorite games on the Sega Genesis. Ranger X was GAO Entertainment's first game for the system, and even though it had a different composer writing its music, that being Yoshinobu Hiraiwa, you can actually hear some of the same instrument settings that would be reused for Crusader of Senti. Sure, it may just be a case of cutting corners later down the line, but I thought it was a neat observation, given the difference in settings and genres. You can hear the similarities between Ranger X and Crusader of Senti at their clearest with the boss theme, but that's only half of why I want to mention it first, because it's also just a good track in general. It immediately gets your blood pumping with a rapid, kick drum-led beat that sounds like pounding machine gun fire. Mix in the electric guitars playing around it, and this definitely gets you ready for action as you take down machines and monsters several times your size. But I don't want to spend this entire segment just comparing Ranger X to the developer's next game, because it has its own musical style to flex, and the second half of Stage 2 is where I think it does best. This whole level involves breaking into a military facility through a system of caves, and it's got a fittingly grungy quality to suit this kind of stealth-adjacent mission. There's also a similar vibe in the music for both halves of the final stage, because I really couldn't decide between one or the other. The first half establishes a clear sense of finality with a dramatic introduction that develops from dire sounding to slightly heroic. Like it's essentially saying, you're near the end of your mission, but don't get too cocky. The second half, meanwhile, is used for a short section where you descend into the final boss's arena. And while it doesn't get a chance to loot before you reach the bottom, I still enjoy how it hypes you up before your final confrontation with the biotech monster. And I have to mention the penultimate stage too, even though I've let myself get out of order here. But hey, variety is the spice of life. This stage has Ranger X flying through a city at night, one that really reminds me of Starlight Zone from Sonic 1 or Neon Knight Riders from TMNT 4 Turtles in Time, but the mood of the music goes right in the opposite direction, building tension as you weave around buildings and hunt for the target enemies. The clappers and vibroslap in the percussion are also amazingly crisp for the hardware, to a point where I'm not entirely sure if they were directly sampled, mimicked, or both through a quick combination of sound channels. The last one I want to highlight is an oddity, even when compared to every other piece of music I've mentioned in this video and the last one. The track in question is the theme for the second half of Stage 1, because you can't normally hear the entire loop before the first boss appears. Yeah, there's a whole minute-long track here, but you only get a small snippet before it cuts to the boss theme. Thank goodness for sound tests, eh? As far as I can tell, Ranger X was a bit of a sleeper hit in the Sega Genesis library, but for GAO Entertainment's first game on the system, it was a pretty incredible feat, as well as a great foundation to improve on for their next title following their merger with Nextech. Yoshinobu Hiraiwa definitely knew how to get some fantastic flavors out of the Black Box's twin sound chips, and yet it was his first and only time working on a video game soundtrack. It wasn't his only job as a composer, of course, but I can't stop chuckling at the notion that Hiraiwa just dropped this absolute class act and then promptly vanished from the industry, like nobody was ready for him to make a sequel. Could you imagine if he and Toshiaki Sakura had a chance to work together? The fourth generation of home consoles is widely considered to have been the beginning of a golden age for role-playing games. The power of 16-bit hardware was making adventures look and sound grander than before, the genre had begun to pick up popularity outside of Japan, and title/series exclusivity played into the console war between Sega and Nintendo. The Super Famicom certainly had titans of the genre like Dragon Quest V, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy VI, but that doesn't mean the Sega Mega Drive was a barren console for RPGs. The Langrisser series got its start on Sega's 16-bit Maverick, and titles like Landstalker, Beyond Oasis, and Phantasy Star 4 were all big hits from its library. Each of these would have been good choices for this list, but I decided to go with another beloved RPG from the Genesis's catalog, as well as a more recent favorite of mine, Shining Force 2. Developed by Sonic Software Planning, who you might recognize today as Camelot Software Planning, Shining Force 2 was made at the height of their partnership with Sega, and despite having a somewhat nightmarish production background, it turned out to be a bestseller. They even got the composer for Landstalker, Moroaki Takenouchi, on board. Takenouchi was a natural choice of composer for an RPG on the Genesis. His style pulled inspiration from progressive rock, fusion jazz, and Western classical music, and he even had experience working under Dragon Quest renowned composer Koichi Sugiyama, back when the world was unaware how much of a bigoted asshole Sugiyama was. These musical influences of Takenouchi's definitely shine through with the standard town theme, which has the PSG chip whistling out a happy melody, while the FM chip provides accompaniment that alternates between descending and ascending lines. Combined with a couple of FM chip solos that break up the main motif of the piece, these techniques give the impression that even though things seem lively and happy, there's still a subtle, ominous feeling in the air. After the first major beat in the game's story, the populace of Grand Seal is forced to flee and build a new home on another continent, where you get access to a home base that allows you to interact with the other characters in your army, and it even comes with its own theme. Ain't that quaint? I really love the bass and snare drums that start the piece, then continue to give the whole track a fittingly march-like quality. The other instruments, meanwhile, mimic a flute, or piccolo, and some assorted brass to establish a cheery, can-do sort of sound that suits a base of operations for Bowie and his ragtag army. Going in a much less militaristic direction, as well as much later into the game, there's the theme for the shrine of the water goddess Metula. Similar to the town theme, this track uses both sound chips to play complementing melodies that take advantage of their respective sound qualities. The FM chip imitates the timbre of a harp and some low brass, while the PSG chip helps accentuate it with a series of rising lines, altogether creating a mood of serenity befitting the sacred space of an important goddess like Metula. I could have mentioned her actual theme, yeah, but personal preference goes to this one. There's also the recurring theme for the dwarven locations on the map, Mithril Diggers. It's bumbling and slightly mischievous sounding, which puts a dumb grin on my face for sure, but what really gets me when it comes to this track is how different the second half of the loop is. When it gets there, the bass starts playing a faster rhythm, and the main clarinet-like instrument is traded for a flute that does a series of improvisations, no doubt reflecting Motoaki Takenouchi's influences from jazz music. But Takenouchi also knows how to deliver when the soundtrack needs to be serious. And the track that stuck out the most to me was the Ruined Area theme, which you first hear after Grand Seal gets backstabbed and invaded by Gollum. Whenever this theme comes up, it's sure to leave an impression, using sustained notes, sound chip reverb, and a touch of vibrato to create a lingering feeling of sorrow and kenopsia. With a soundtrack that showcases a colorful palette of moods and musical inspirations, Shining Force 2 definitely puts Motoaki Takenouchi's skill as a composer on display. And if you ever want to take the plunge and give RPGs on the Sega Genesis a try, this is a great one to start with. Or maybe I'm just a little bit biased because I spent part of my youth playing Camelot's other well-regarded RPG series. No scary chess pieces in that one! One particular genre I've neglected to mention between these two lists is puzzle games, and the Sega Genesis came along at a pretty pivotal point in time for the genre. Several big names like Lemmings, Dr. Mario, and Puyo Puyo were getting ready to hit the market, and, like many other companies, Sega tried to cash in on the Tetris craze of the late 80s, releasing a version for arcades and developing a console release for the Mega Drive. But with Atari and Nintendo going to court over publishing rights, Sega ended production on their Mega Drive version in favor of looking for another puzzle game to promote in its place. That game was Columns, famously featured in the Genesis Does advertisements. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not a big fan of the soundtrack for the original Columns, but I get what they were going for. Tetris had its Russian motifs, and Columns would go for a more Greco-Roman/Egyptian flavor to stand out. There was certainly potential, it just needed a bit of polish, and thankfully, that would happen with the release of Columns 3 in 1993, which brought one of the three composers for Shinobi 3, Morihiko Akiyama, to the table. Boy, that's a lot of threes. Morihiko Akiyama already did great work with Shinobi 3, enough for me to consider talking about that game instead of this one. But he was on his own for Columns 3, and after comparing the two, it sounds like he was comfortable having more room to spread his wings. That makes the soundtrack for Columns 3 a little more special to my eyes, ears, hence why I chose to feature it. Right off the top of my head, I think my favorite track here is the credits theme, Column Dive, which I initially misread as Column Drive, because my first impression of this was that it sounded like something you'd play in your car as you drive down a highway at sunset. Seriously, put this over some graphics of vaporwave cityscapes or lo-fi footage of passing scenery, and it fits perfectly. Also good, and also from the single-player campaign, is Explorer, a gritty and aggressive-sounding piece that suits a one-on-one duel, and also complements the pyramid setting with a slight Egyptian touch. Considering the number of opponents you have to go through in this mode, it's a track you're gonna be hearing quite a bit, so it ought to be enjoyable, no? But the real steak and potatoes of the soundtrack comes from its assortment of versus themes, one of which is a track that, to me at least, sounds like a section from Moscow by Genghis Khan. And I can't tell if that's me being crazy or not, because I have no idea what a honeydew with an Ethernet connection has to do with German disco, but it exists, I guess? My favorites of the two-player versus themes are the Japanese-sounding track First Year of Genroku and Pemo Pemo Kuroto, which, as the name suggests, is a remix of Clotho from the original columns, spruced up with Morihiko Akiyama's style. Although these aren't meant to sound Russian, they both remind me a lot of the soundtrack for Tengen Tetris on the NES, also known as Atari Tetris for you arcade enthusiasts, or Tyotyais if you like to take the piss out of Faux Cyrillic. Considering that's my favorite incarnation of Tetris, especially because of the music, reminding me of that is a big plus. The tutorial has its own cute little theme, and one I imagine most people would ordinarily gloss over. Titled Sunday, it's a simple tune that sounds reminiscent of a guitar and violin duet, like the sound of waking up on a lazy weekend. This may be the most relaxed I'll ever be, as a talking chicken teaches me how to play a puzzle game while sipping tea, but then again, it would probably be very strange if that happened more than once. Even if the Column series may not have been the Tetris killer that hardcore Sega enthusiasts were hoping for back in the 90s, that doesn't mean that it was a failure. Columns 3 is a game that exudes a delightful amount of charm, in large part from Morihiko Akiyama's musical contributions. The way I feel about the soundtrack for Columns 3 is a lot like a combination of my earlier thoughts on Shining Force 2 and Wiz and Liz, in that it's a soundtrack that shows the composer's skill through the variety of styles and moods they can pack into one cartridge, and that much of it is just pure fun. Like, you can really tell that Akiyama enjoyed working on this game. It was also the last time he wrote music for the base hardware of the Sega Genesis, so you could definitely say he went out with style. So you know how a lot of games released on the Super Nintendo had Super in the title? You would think that the Genesis library would have more than a handful of games with Mega in their title, because, you know, Mega Drive. But instead, it had a bit of a fixation with the word Force. We've mentioned Thunder Force and Shining Force already, so how about we force in another Force by forcing Galaxy Force 2 aside, and then forcibly talk about Burning Force instead? That wasn't too forced now, was it? Originally released for arcades in 1989, Burning Force was ported to the Genesis a year later, though apparently the fact that it had a female protagonist was an issue that needed to be redacted when it was brought here to the United States. What a strange time that must have been. As far as the music goes, this one might be a little more divisive compared to the other games I've highlighted. Now, I will agree that the original arcade version has the more palatable soundtrack for general audiences, but it was still a commendable effort converting the music from the twin sound chips of the Namco System 2 arcade board to the twin sound chips of the Sega Genesis. And as someone that enjoys the signature twang of the Genesis, the difference in sound quality doesn't really faze me all that much. In fact, I'd say the grungier sound of the Genesis version brings out a more intense feeling that better matches the gameplay for a Space Harrier-inspired shoot-'em-up. Although I'm kind of neutral on the music for the first stage, the second stage grabbed my attention almost immediately. After a few seconds of starting grunge, it breaks for a bass guitar that continues the beat, and an electric guitar that practically wails in true hard rock fashion. When I listened to Burning Force's soundtrack for the first time, I was genuinely surprised by this one. And after listening to it a few more times, I think I figured out why it sounded so good. The instruments being used remind me of the Mega Man X games, although Burning Force came out first, about 4 years prior. If Capcom decided to make the X series for the Genesis instead of the Super Nintendo, I could easily imagine it sounding similar to this. The music for the fourth stage is another one that I think shows how the more limited technology actually benefits the Genesis version. While the original arcade version is good, the percussion kind of drowns out the main instrument. But with the Genesis version, it's more properly balanced and sounds much better, despite the reduced sound quality. Bit of a shame the Genesis version doesn't have the night variations of the level themes like the arcade version, but hey, what is here makes up for it. Much like the track I just mentioned, the music for the bonus minigame also sounds better on the Genesis than it does for the arcade, largely because of better audio balancing. In this case, the emphasis is on the bass, and in the arcade version, it's hard to hear over the drums and even harder to hear over the collection sound effects. With the Genesis version, everything is right, and the lower sound of the bass makes it sound groovier and less Seinfeld-y. Oh man, the ending theme too. It sounds so much better without the synthesized choir that's in the arcade version, and the percussion, ironically, has more oomph to it this time around. It's also got this stanky as hell lead instrument that might be a guilty pleasure of mine. Of all the games I picked out for these two lists, Burning Force might be the most controversial one, and I don't expect people to warm up to it like the others. It may have lost the full impact of its visual effects when it went from the arcade to home consoles, but as I've hopefully established here, the music found a new sense of appeal in spite of the less powerful hardware. In a way, it's a lot like what I said about the Vectorman soundtrack. It's not about the materials you have, it's how you use them. And the composer for Burning Force, Yoshinori Kawamoto, would go on to write music for games like Star Fox Assault, Tekken 7, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So I guess he knew a thing or two about using those materials. At last, after 9 great games with phenomenal music, we reach the end. And just like the first round of soundtracks, I saved the very best of the batch for last. So what do you say we end things off with one of the most beloved platformers from the tail end of the Sega Genesis's lifespan? That's right, it's Ristar time. Can't wait to see those comments about how I'm mispronouncing the name. Part of why I teased Ristar in the first list, but didn't actually talk about it, was because I didn't feel like I was quite ready to tackle it at the time. I know it sounds like I've said this about every game from both lists, but Ristar's soundtrack is genuinely incredible from start to finish. There isn't a single bad piece of music in this game, and when you're dealing with something that thorough in quality, trying to put those thoughts to words can be a persistent obstacle. Now though, I think I have the proper confidence to go into detail about what I like regarding Tomoko Sasaki's masterpiece on the Mega Drive. Although she's probably most well known for her work on the Knights series, Tomoko Sasaki was writing music for video games as early as 1992, with World of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck for the Sega Genesis. A game I would have considered for one of these lists, if I weren't terrified of the mouse and his lawyers potentially coming after me. Ristar was only Sasaki's second time writing music for the system's base hardware, but she also had prior experience working on titles for the Sega CD and the 32X, so she definitely knew the console's audio capabilities, and it shows. In contrast to its simple and straightforward gameplay, Ristar has a rich soundtrack that has the console's twin sound chips just about firing on all cylinders. Using all 6 sound channels from the YM2612 FM chip, and 3 of the 4 sound channels from the SN76489 PSG chip. The very first level theme not only sets the tone of the adventure ahead, but also provides a fantastic showing of the musical depth that Tomoko Sasaki could get out of the Genesis. The Latin horns that help give it a tropical sound, the way the noise channel is used to mimic the sound of maracas and accentuate the more traditional percussion, how the sample channel is used to play sounds of cheering at the height of the loop like it's celebrating the arrival of Ristar. All of this reminds me a lot of Palm Tree Panic from Sonic CD. But given Ristar's roots as an evolved prototype for the original Sonic, that might have actually been the intent. For that matter, one of the 2 composers for Sonic CD, Masafumi Ogata, wrote the music for one level in Ristar, but it's much later in the game, and he wasn't even the one who handled the music for Palm Tree Panic. I just wanted to mention that bit of trivia, and I should probably play the audio sample before I go on a longer tangent about Sonic CD. Another great example of the soundtrack's depth is the music for the second world, Planet Undertow, and how both of its themes are textured in ways that complement the aquatic level design. From incorporating the sounds of rising bubbles, to using sustained tones from the PSG chip and reverb provided by the FM chip, the music practically makes you feel like you're underwater. It's a hard call, but between the two, I think I prefer Break Silence from the second half just a little more. It'd be wrong of me not to mention World 4, since it happens to be music-themed, and the first half of Planet Sonata does something really, really cool with that. The level itself has Ristar picking up metronomes and giving them to songbirds so that he can progress. All the while, the background music starts with only the bare beach. With each songbird you help, another portion gets added to the music, and the finished piece is nothing short of satisfying. It's a clever gimmick for the level, and it's absolutely adorable how it incorporates vocal samples, suggesting that Ristar, being the star child that he is, can't help but sing along. Planet Freon is where my very favorite pieces from the soundtrack can be found, because both level themes here are phenomenal and play to the area's frozen aesthetics. The track for the first half, Ring Rink, begins with Christmas-like bells and chimes before transitioning to a combination of a high-pitched whistle, an electric piano, and a brass synth that all give it a wonderfully optimistic sound, like all the joy of a snow day rolled into a single piece of music. And on top of that, there's some sampled drum beats and a funky slap bass to make it sound cool in another way. And if it wasn't groovy enough for the first half, the second dials it up to 11 by adapting the melody for a different set of instruments, chief of which is a pair of synths that once again take advantage of the Genesis's reverb functionality. Considering this level takes place around an icy lake, it's like the music itself is flowing with, and reverberating through, the water, like a cooler variant of Planet Undertow from earlier. This is another one of my absolute favorite pieces of music written for the Sega Genesis, and I feel no shame in admitting that I've listened to this while walking out in snowy weather. You should try it sometime, if you can. Lastly, I want to talk about a fitting spectacle, and that's the final boss theme, which immediately makes itself known by hitting you with a daunting, alien-sounding piece as you enter Kaiser Greedy's throne room. You may have heard this bit of trivia once or twice before, but this track is handled in a way that complements Kaiser Greedy's personality throughout the fight. The slower, more intimidating portion of the music begins the fight, as Kaiser Greedy stays seated on his throne, then fights while shrouded behind his cape. But when the faster and more intense part of the music kicks in, he's usually taken enough damage to go into his final phase, fighting directly and unleashing his most powerful attacks now that he views Ristar as a genuine opponent. It happens so naturally, and makes the duel all the more incredible. There's so much to talk about with the soundtrack, that once I had the confidence to tackle it, I had to be strict on myself not to get too carried away. From all the tracks I highlighted or mentioned, to the ones I didn't, like the music for the bonus games or the regular boss theme, I really do mean it when I say that Ristar has an incredible soundtrack from start to finish. While Ristar may have initially fallen into obscurity due to its launch at the end of the Sega Genesis's lifespan, thanks to the advent of the internet, as well as Sega continually re-releasing it for a variety of platforms, it's been able to pick up part of the following it's always deserved. It's a fantastic game with one of the most enjoyable soundtracks the Sega Genesis could offer, and it's more accessible than ever. If you haven't given it a try yet, you've got nothing to lose. Except maybe your boredom, but why would you want to hold on to that? And thus ends the second batch of great soundtracks on the Sega Genesis. Compared to the first video, I was a little more experimental with the selection here. The original list was almost entirely comprised of games I was familiar with, but with this one, I spiced things up by including a few games I hadn't played in depth, at least not before working on this. I really hope that gamble paid off, and that some of you watching might have found a new game or composer that piqued your interest. Just like before, I'd love to hear what you thought about these games and their music, or what some of your favorite soundtracks for the Sega Genesis are. so feel free to mention them in the comments section. Keep your eyes peeled for a third list at some point in the future as well. There's a few more games I know I'd love to talk about, but I'd also like to give myself some time to focus on other projects, both on and away from YouTube. And thanks a bunch for continuing to bear with me while I experiment with different kinds of content here and beyond. Whether you're fairly new here, or you've been watching my videos for years, it means a lot to have you here, especially in times as weird and unpredictable as these. In the meantime, I feel weirdly compelled to go out and buy a cheeseburger. But there's a repair bill I've received from some countess named Elizabeth Bartley that I need to take care of first. So remember to stay safe, stay lovely, and until next time, take care.